Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you so much to Joelle for this cogent introduction to MMT. Perhaps I should preface my comments by saying that I speak in a personal capacity and my views are not reflective of the Post-Keynesian economics society. I will start from a slightly different place and I think set out what I see as a possible problem we face. Well, set out where I see the problems and ask some questions about how we should characterize that problem. And then I think I'll probably circle back towards the end and make some comments about where I align with the previous discussion and where I, in some places, depart. So I'm going to start with three questions. Number one, is this the end of the age of abundance? Now, I wanted to call the presentation the end of the age of affluence because it has more of a kind of Galbraith feel to it, but it didn't seem quite accurate. So in the end, I went for age of abundance, which is not so elegant, but hopefully is a bit more accurate. So I'll set out what I mean by the question and then give some possible answers to it. If we answer the question in the positive, what implications for macroeconomic policy and theory, and on that basis, where next for macro policy institutional design? And I apologize at the end, I'm going to get a bit parochial and I'm going to narrow in onto British macro institutional design because that's the area which I've been looking at and thinking about of late, but hopefully there'll be some relevance for other places. Okay, what do I mean by is it the end of the age of abundance? For 30 plus years, I think the right policy recommendation was raise aggregate demand. It was pretty straightforward. In rich countries, you would go not far wrong by making that policy recommendation, I think. Now, I'm following the rules, which are no equations. So I'm not insulting your intelligence with this diagram. The diagram was developed with Adam Abu Bakr for a paper in the ILO with the intention of trying to translate some of our ideas to a wider audience. But I realized I could use it in this presentation to get around the no equations rule. So really what this means is assume a Leontief production function, closed economy with overall labor shortages but current unemployment. And I'll make a few different versions of this to try and illustrate some different Kaleckian ideas, really, because ultimately Kaleckian model is embedded in my head, and it's the way that I tend to think through these kind of questions. For much of the last decades, unused capacity meant it was possible to expand output and employment without generating or experiencing inflationary pressure. Is that still the case? Are we still in the world where raise aggregate demand is pretty much the only thing you need to say wherever you are and whoever you're speaking to, although you frame it slightly differently depending on where we are? Now, I was expecting a different slide there, but that's okay. As we know, we're currently experiencing, these might not be the new slides that I put on the, is it possible that these are not the new slides that I put on the machine? Let me just check. No, actually, can I just very briefly just check if I can see on this laptop, because I did put some new ones on. I think. Yeah. It's okay, I can work with these. No, these are definitely the old ones. Sorry, I'm just going to, these are like 2 stages old. I've got a USB stick. If you don't mind, I'm just going to pull my USB stick out of my pocket. That thing there that says some figures, that's a note to myself. Yeah, there's a law about USB sticks, which is you always put it in upside down first. Now I've got to speak computer in German again for a moment. There was a prediction, wasn't there, on Twitter about technical problems. Didn't somebody say this? All right, I'm going to try and just do this live off the USB stick. Let's see. We've done this. We've done this. What have I done wrong? Oh, well, that's a nuisance. Okay, I'm going to carry on with these slides. Maybe I can get them out of my email. Let me just check. Sorry, this is not supposed to be a comedy routine. I'm just going to carry on with these slides. I've got enough here to be going on with. All right, we know. Can you imagine some figures about short-run inflation and bottlenecks? I'll put those on the website in the updated slide deck. We are going to be experiencing, in addition to the current short-run inflation and bottlenecks, extreme weather, droughts, floods, wildfires, and so on. And one view is that the current bottlenecks and triggers will ease, but ongoing supply shocks is in some way a new normal. And this view has been put by Isabel Schnabel of the ECB. It hasn't been put, I think, so obviously in progressive circles, but I have seen people like James Medway in the UK and Adam Tooze begin to make comments along these lines. So, is it possible that we face a situation where recurrent supply shocks, increasingly driven by climate crisis, are an important driver of supply-side shocks, I shouldn't say shocks, price pressures and bottlenecks? While I'm focusing to start with on, I really do want to change my slide deck. I'm just going to think about, while I'm talking, I'm going to think about how I can get into my email and get the one I really want out. I put a whole bunch of new slides in just before the show, and now I realize I really want them. Are we also facing potential supplies on the labor side? I'm less convinced by this, but there are stories to this effect. The effect of long COVID, for example, the shifting out of jobs phenomenon we're seeing, the great resignation, as some have called it. There's also the story that Goodhart has been telling for a while, which I was increasingly skeptical about, but I'm now wondering about the end of the big labor shock from China coming into the world market and so on. Is that going to give us labor shortages and therefore pressures on that side? Okay, so that's roughly speaking the argument for the end of abundance. What's the counter-argument? The counter-argument is short-run supply disruption will ease, secular stagnation is going to be back, and this is, this is just a blip, and we're going to be back to that 30-year Treasury chart, which I did put into the deck, but now I can't find it, which, as you've shown, has been falling for about 20 or 30 years, and has now got a spike on the end of it, which is really quite remarkable. There's nothing in the 30, 40-year period which has that uptick. Now, I'm the last person to talk about natural rates of interest and R* and so on, but when you look at that chart, you do think, is something going on here? Other parts of the counter-argument, and I'm not going to attribute this to anyone in particular because I don't want to be accused of straw person arguments, but I do detect this response when I raise this question. Technology and shifting consumption habits over time will lower emissions. Distribution can be improved by raising incomes at the bottom. We don't need to do redistribution in terms of constraints anywhere else in the system. And therefore, constraining any part of aggregate demand is regressive and should be opposed. The counter-argument also points to this dynamic, decoupling of emissions from GDP, to argue against any kind of constraints on economic activity. And I had a couple of other charts here which I was going to put in, which I think show that I'm not convinced that this dynamic is moving fast enough. Ultimately, the change has to be technological. We can only get out of this through a technological solution, but in the short run, we've got to flatten the curve. To borrow an analogy from the pandemic, and flattening the curve may involve a whole bunch of other things as well as accelerating technological improvements. You can see that's another note to myself. What I've done is actually I've taken off the more recent slide deck and somehow replaced it with an older one from my memory stick. I don't know quite how I've done that. Never mind. So I started thinking to myself, how do we frame this in post-Keynesian terms? Is this really the standard post-Keynesian story in the top there, where you have excess capital and ultimately shortages of labor, but unemployment, and therefore you should raise aggregate demand to absorb the labor? Or is it the Peter Scott story about developing countries, where ultimately you're capital constrained, which comes from Kalecki and Joan Robinson, And again, this chart, I did go through and put all the citations. It's from the paper with Adam. So at first I thought maybe this is the way to get into this problem, but then I changed my mind. So I'm going to come back to how I think we should characterize this. Before I do that, let me just make a point about distribution and climate change. I was really struck by this chart from the World Inequality Report. This is the United States by decile, showing per capita emissions by income group. Some of them are deciles, some of them are bigger chunks. Top 10% there on the right. Now, the right-hand pane shows the reduction required to get to the 2030 targets. The 2030 targets are insufficient to reach either 1%, 1.5%, 2% targets. So these, if anything, are insufficient reductions in emissions. If you look at charts for Europe, their magnitude on the scale is substantially lower. You're looking at about half, approximately, the height for rich European countries. But the story is the same. We need enormous reductions in emissions, and I question whether we can do that purely through technological acceleration, innovation, investment, and so on. Okay, what do we get from the post-Keynesian literature on the question of how we get into the climate solutions? There's some excellent literature out there, and on the correct slide deck I've actually got the dates in there. Malcolm Sawyer and Giuseppe have done some great stuff where they show that the warranted growth and the climate compatible rate of growth, there's no reason to believe those are the same, and that really brings us back to where we were in the debates in the last couple of days, where in the first plenary Gabrielle showed us 3 rates of growth, and how do you get them to intersect in a socially acceptable way? I somewhat flippantly asked the question of Mark yesterday when he was showing us all the different ways that demand and supply can be brought into alignment. I said, well, okay, how do you bring it into alignment with the third one, which is the climate? But I do think this is the crucial question. There's some fascinating stuff in the recent issue of Egypt about what happens in a degrowth or a zero growth system. Are positive rates of profit still possible? The answer seems to be sort of, in a slightly different way to usual. One thing that comes out of these, which is really interesting, and I think comes fairly directly to MMT kind of questions, is in a zero growth system, at least with positive interest rates, you can't have sectoral imbalances. You've basically got to have a balanced budget for each sector of the economy, otherwise you get explosive growth. And if you play with a simulation model for even a couple of minutes, you get this result quite quickly. You can kind of get the intuition of what's going on with it. And there are really interesting debates about, of course, super multiplier type situations. Is the kind of investment we need for a green transition something which could come out of induced investment in a super multiplier model, or is it something which has to be imposed on the system from the outside? But I want to ask a slightly more direct question here, which is, what about the short run? What about getting from where we are now to the point where we've done the investment we need? I mean, I think at some point low growth, degrowth may be part of that flattening the curve, but it's very clear, I think, to everybody pretty much that a big investment push is what's required now. How does this require us to update a traditional post-Keynesian progressive macro program? If we accept that we have now some kind of supply-side constraints, we have the need for large-scale investment, and at some point we need to move towards zero carbon emissions based on technological growth. A traditional PK, progressive macro policy program, is, I think, actually in many ways quite similar to what was presented in the first presentation. Fiscal expansion, public investment, public consumption, transfers, accommodating monetary policy to allow that to happen, but largely allow the deficit to adjust to accommodate high employment, financial regulation and intervention, greater tolerance of inflation than perhaps a 2% inflation target, and progressive taxation. What do we need to update from this program to reflect the current reality? I don't think I need to talk through this slide because we kind of know what our common theoretical elements are. Let's move on to some interesting debates. Determinants of investment growth. Ultimately, in post-Keynesian models, we think of growth as determined by the growth of the capital stock. It's investment which is driving it. Is that something which is driven by distribution, by wages? Can we characterize demands? We all know the wage-led, profit-led stories. Questions about the long run. Is investment fully autonomous? Does the rate of capacity utilization adjust? How much adjustment is possible to exogenous elements, and so on. Interest rate determination, horizontalists versus structuralists, those of us who think that money is fully accommodating of demand, and those of us who take a structuralist view, including myself, who think that financial structure imposes a whole bunch of additional stuff on top of that. And coming back to the first presentation, debates about budget deficits and taxation, a functional finance view associated with modern monetary theory, and another group who I actually didn't have a name for, but I would put myself in, who I would call fiscal structuralists. I think there is a parallel with the horizontalist structuralist debate in terms of banking and the MMT post-Keynesian debate in terms of government deficits. Okay, what's missing from a PK package of that sort? In many ways, what's missing is the potential for the supply side to constrain our options, and we discussed this among during the plenary yesterday, among other things. So given the need for high investment and lower emissions, consumption may need to be constrained for some groups, for some forms of consumption. How can or should that constraint be achieved if it is indeed we agree that it is required? And let me just restate the case. Why do we want to do that? Why do we need to constrain consumption? To reduce emissions directly, there are some parts of consumption which I think are just hard to justify on any basis, given how much emissions they produce. To free productive capacity and emissions capacity for investment. If we want to invest, that's going to generate emissions. And if we want to invest enough, ultimately to get to net zero in the short run, it's going to generate emissions when we can produce space by reducing our consumption. And to free productive capacity and emissions capacity for redistribution. If we want to raise the incomes of those at the bottom, both within countries and globally, we're going to have to make space in some way, I think, to do that. So I had a much better picture than this, which I was going to have to show you, but I've nearly got. Let me talk you through the picture that I replaced this with in the slide deck I was hoping to show you. I first drew this picture, and then I decided it was wrong. And I moved the inflation barrier out to leave a gap, because I don't think we are, for the most part, at the inflation barrier in terms of domestic excess demand in excess of domestic excess supply. If you look at the components of inflation in most rich countries, and I am implicitly talking mostly about rich countries at this point, in the UK, for example, 10% CPI, of that subcomponent, 15% food inflation. That isn't excess domestic demand driving inflation in the UK. It's coming from the bottom. So my other diagram had an upward arrow coming from imported goods. In a sense, there's a sort of global supply shortage relative to demand, but in terms of domestic policy making, it's coming as an imported price pressure constraint. So I want to propose, and this goes to a piece by Paulo dos Santos, and I'm really glad Paulo's here in the audience, that Adam and I drew on. Adam's here as well somewhere. Paulo suggested a terminology of consumption-led versus investment-led, and he didn't say strategies. I think he might have said regimes or something like that. But I think we need to think in terms of consumption-led strategies versus investment-led strategies. And in the short run, we need an investment-led strategy. What is the difference? A consumption-led strategy aims to raise the rate of GDP growth by induced investment. You either, in some way, put more cash into the pockets of those on lower incomes. They have higher propensities to consume, for the most part, therefore they raise their consumption. And we think that businesses react to higher consumption by raising their capital investment. Wage-led growth, for example, I would say we could categorize as a consumption-led strategy in the sense that the trigger for higher investment is actually higher consumption. An investment-led strategy aims to raise the growth rate of the capital stock either without going through a consumption mechanism, or possibly even without simultaneously raising consumption. And this raises some fairly awkward questions, which I'll come to in a moment. I've got 10 minutes left. 6 minutes left. I had 10 minutes left 4 minutes ago. Some unpleasant Keynesian arithmetic. If we buy the story that we may need to constrain consumption in order to raise investment, in order to make it through the green transition, we come up with some fairly unpleasant results for a Keynesian like myself. Overall policy packages may have lower or even negative multipliers. We may know that there's a consumption multiplier of 2, meaning that for every dollar of investment, we get $1 of consumption. And that may bring us to the barrier, the inflation barrier, the domestic inflation barrier, quicker than we want to get to it. That may mean that deficits don't pay for themselves, and that debt stocks will have to be higher for longer. If we want to raise investment without raising GDP in the same way that we have previously argued through multipliers, we may have to accept lower overall growth rates and lower and higher debt stocks, I think, for the time being. I'm going to skip over there. Okay, so some controversies associated with the suggestions I'm making here. This opens up all kinds of difficult questions about taxation, the role of taxation. Do we need to pay for government spending using taxation? And I would say that there are 2 crucial roles here. One is to prevent exceeding domestic productive capacity and therefore generating price pressure. The other is, and this is where I disagree, I think, with the MMT perspective, the other is you cannot assume that all holders of your liabilities, whether reserves or bonds, will willingly hold those liabilities in a system of global capital flows and flexible exchange rates, or even managed exchange rates. And so I think there's a dual role for taxation, and I'll come back to that in a minute's time if I have a minute to do it. 5 minutes. This means that there are limits to quantitative easing, yield curve control, use of the central bank to manage interest rates, and in particular to manage interest rates on government debt. I'm going to skip the debates about green monetary policy. I might come back to that in the questions. And ultimately, this brings us to the question of monetary hierarchies. We have Paolo's question from the first plenary. What determines your position in the monetary hierarchy? We know if you try and fight against the bond market, which is trying to sell your bonds using the central bank, using yield curve control, those of us who are emerging market scholars know exactly what happens. We know where the pressure comes. Reserve pressure, exchange rate pressure, interest rate pressure, and so on. Which countries don't experience those pressures to some extent or degree? Is how I would reframe Paolo's question. Rather than trying to say, what is it that determines monetary sovereignty, I would say, which countries don't experience ultimately an exchange rate constraint? You know, you do government spending, bondholders don't want to hold your bonds. Okay, so you use the central bank, you replace bonds with reserves, you peg the interest rate, ultimately they're going to sell your currency. That's where the constraint is going to come, and that's going to raise import prices, and you're going to get inflation. Different kind of inflation to the other inflation. The arrow that I didn't manage to put on my graph in front of the little commodities. Who doesn't experience these pressures? I think the answer is one country. There's one country in the world which can get away with not worrying about holders of its liabilities. So I think we need to talk about the trade-off between using taxation, constraining demand, to, as well as be a demand brake, also using taxation to constrain the growth of government spending. The country I come from has been conducting its own very unique experiment in the limits to monetary sovereignty over the last couple of days. I really wanted to put in the chart from the FT of the moron risk premium, where they showed how the external constraint has bound. Another recent interesting example is Japan. Japan operates a yield curve control regime, and if you look at a Bloomberg chart, the one that's not in the slide deck because this is the wrong deck, the yield on Japanese Bonds is right up against the upper ceiling. And at the same time, the exchange rate is pretty much a vertical line, even on a really long-run chart. And they were doing emergency, when I looked yesterday, the Japanese central bank were doing emergency operations to try and tame those pressures. Japan has a current account surplus. It's a big country. It's got a liquid bond market. It's rich. If the UK and Japan can't do it, I don't think there are many countries out there which can do it. Do I have 1 minute left? Or am I into Engelbert's -1? I have 2. Okay, so that makes 3, including the special one. Okay, so let me bring this back round and say, okay, what is it we actually want then in terms of policy design? I had a whole slide full of an updated post-Keynesian policy. Never mind, I haven't got time to talk about it. What would we want to see as a meaningful first step for policy redesign? And here I actually realign with the MMT presentation. I do think we now have to accept that monetary policy and fiscal policy are absolutely interrelated. The recent episodes only reinforce that. In the UK, essentially threatening a financial crisis as a way of getting the government under control is not an optimal approach to monetary fiscal coordination. Sometimes I write a letter to the governor, that's the rules. Other times I threaten a financial crisis. I think we can do better. So what do we want? We want monetary fiscal coordination. How do we get it? And I would say as a starter, we get it through minimal, meaningful institutional change. And others might disagree with me on this, but I think we don't need to challenge central bank independence because we're going to get huge pushback. I'm into the world of real politics here. You know, if you want to tell your government which policy shall we implement to get us one step in the right direction, those of you who have a government, what can you suggest? And I would say that minor changes to the institutional framework are a good first step. I would like to see a change in the mandate for the Bank of England, and this is where I'm getting parochial, a dual mandate for employment and inflation, plus some kind of formal coordination mechanism between the Treasury and the central bank. And you'll notice I have a third institution here. And as I was thinking about this, and this is part of some work I'm doing with some co-authors, we concluded that you actually need 3. You have to have 3 institutions to get through the next period: a national investment bank, a treasury, and a central bank. And we need to come up with, and these will be nationally specific, I think, and even the 3 that I've selected may not be exactly right for each country. We need to come up with nationally specific ways of coordinating between these institutions and all the other relevant institutions, such as the Debt Management Office, labour bargaining institutions, devolved administrations, and so on. So that would be my starter to bring us back to actual agreement, really. We do need the possibility for the central bank to intervene in the gilt market. However, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that that does come with limits, side effects, and we need to consider the pros and cons of each in its place. Okay, I'm into Engelbert's -1, so I stop there, and thank you very much.